America saw him as an unbreakable cowboy, tall, fearless, and carved out of pure grit. But behind that image, Clint Walker was quietly fighting battles no audience ever saw. There were moments when his life nearly ended in seconds, when doctors believed it was already over, and when the man known for strength had to confront how fragile everything really was. Years after he was gone, those closest to him finally spoke about what he endured, the pain he carried, the silence he chose, and the truth hidden behind Hollywood's toughest smile. And once you hear what actually happened, it changes the way you see Clint Walker forever. Built by hard work, not Hollywood. Before Hollywood ever knew his name, Clint Walker was already living a life most people wouldn't survive. He was born into a working-class family, raised alongside his twin brother, and learned early that nothing would be handed to him. School didn't hold his attention for long. What did was work. Real work. Factory floors, riverboats, long hours, and rough conditions shaped him faster than any classroom ever could. While other teenagers were still figuring out who they were, Walker made a decision that would harden him for life. He joined the United States Merchant Marine, trading comfort for discipline and safety for uncertainty. Life at sea wasn't adventurous in the Hollywood sense. It was exhausting, dangerous, and relentless. Storms didn't care who you were, and mistakes weren't forgiven. Those years taught him something that stayed with him forever: how to endure quietly. No applause, no sympathy, just survival. And that mindset followed him everywhere, including into a world that would soon try to turn him into a myth. But Hollywood didn't see the scars, it only saw the size, the strength, and the opportunity. Hollywood's interest came with strings. When Clint Walker finally crossed paths with Hollywood, it wasn't talent scouts chasing emotion or range, it was his presence that stopped people cold. He was towering, broad-shouldered, and impossible to miss. That alone made him valuable, and soon the industry moved in. One man in particular took notice: Henry Wilson, a powerful talent agent known for discovering and reshaping young actors. Wilson had a reputation for turning raw men into marketable stars, but his methods were often questioned. Reports over the years have suggested his control over clients went far beyond career advice, shaping how they looked, spoke, and even who they were allowed to be. Nothing was ever proven, but the rumors never really faded. Under Wilson's guidance, Walker was pushed into a full rebrand. His rugged, no-nonsense identity didn't fit Hollywood's polish, so it was adjusted. Even his name was briefly changed, an attempt to mold him into something smoother, more glamorous, more sellable. But that version never quite fit. Walker wasn't built for artifice, and the more Hollywood tried to refine him, the more uncomfortable it became. Still, opportunity has a way of overpowering instinct. Roles started coming, doors opened fast. And before he fully realized what was happening, Walker was standing on the edge of fame, the kind that lifts you up while quietly taking control. And then came the role that would define him, whether he wanted it to or not. The role that turned him into a legend. When the role of Cheyenne Bodie appeared, it didn't just offer Clint Walker work, it offered him an identity. Television wasn't looking for nuance at that moment, it was looking for certainty. A man who looked like he belonged to the land, who could stand still and make the screen feel small around him. And Walker did that effortlessly. From the moment he appeared on screen, the reaction was immediate. Viewers didn't question whether he was believable, they accepted him. His size alone set him apart, but it was the quiet authority that held attention. He didn't overact, he didn't explain himself. He simply existed in the frame, and that was enough. The network leaned into it fast. Cameras framed him to emphasize scale. Wardrobe choices weren't subtle. The frequent bare-chested scenes weren't about story. They were about reinforcing the myth. Strength, control, masculinity. Week after week, audiences were trained to see him as something solid and unbreakable. And it worked. Cheyenne didn't just succeed, it dominated. It quickly outpaced the other shows it rotated alongside, becoming the breakout star of the lineup. Walker's face was everywhere. His image became shorthand for the Western hero itself. Warner Bros. Didn't see a man anymore. They saw a formula that worked, but formulas come with limitations. Behind the scenes, Walker was working at a pace that never let up. Long days, physically demanding scenes, minimal recovery time. The role required endurance, and Hollywood assumed his body would simply keep delivering. No one asked how sustainable it was, no one planned for wear and tear. What made it more complicated was that Walker genuinely liked the genre. He enjoyed being outdoors, he liked the physical challenge. So when opportunities came exclusively in westerns, he didn't push back. He accepted the narrowing path, not realizing how hard it would be to step off it later. The image hardened over time. Audiences stopped seeing an actor playing a role. They saw him as the cowboy, quiet, stoic, indestructible, and once that perception set in, changing it became nearly impossible. That pressure didn't come from critics or studios alone, it came from expectation. Fans wanted consistency, executives wanted reliability, and Walker, who had spent his entire life proving he could endure, gave them exactly what they asked for. But the cost of carrying that image would surface in a way no script could ever prepare him for. The day everything should have ended. It wasn't a stunt. It wasn't a scene gone wrong, and there was no warning. On a clear day at Mammoth Mountain, Clint Walker was skiing like he'd done countless times before. He wasn't reckless, he wasn't showing off. Then the terrain shifted, uneven, unpredictable, and in seconds, control was gone. His body twisted, momentum took over, and the fall became violent. What happened next defied belief. One of his ski poles drove into his chest with devastating force, reaching his heart. The pain was immediate, overwhelming, and catastrophic. People nearby froze. There was no dramatic struggle, no chance to brace for impact. It was sudden, the kind of moment where everything changes before you can process what's happening. By the time emergency help arrived, the situation looked grim. At the hospital, doctors worked fast, but the damage was severe. For a brief moment, there were no clear signs of life. The man the world knew as unbreakable was pronounced gone, and then, almost unbelievably, one doctor hesitated. Something didn't feel right, a faint indication, barely there, a possibility so small it could have been missed entirely. Acting on instinct, the medical team rushed him into emergency surgery. His heart was repaired under impossible conditions, racing against time that had already nearly run out. Against every expectation, Clint Walker survived. Later, he would admit the experience changed him in ways he never fully explained. He spoke quietly about a moment suspended between life and whatever comes after. Something deeply personal, something he chose not to sensationalize. He didn't dramatize it, he didn't exploit it. He simply acknowledged that he had been somewhere else and came back. What made it even harder to comprehend was how close it all was to never being known. One overlooked detail, one missed sign, and the story would have ended right there on a mountainside. But survival came with a cost, because once you've stood that close to the edge, everything afterward feels different, even if you never say it out loud. And instead of slowing down, Clint Walker made a choice that would shock even the people who saved his life. Back to work like nothing happened. Most people would have stepped away after something like that, slowed down, reconsidered everything. Clint Walker did the opposite. Within a shockingly short time, he was back on his feet and back on set. Doctors were stunned, colleagues were confused, but to Walker, stopping felt more dangerous than continuing. Work had always been how he survived, physically and mentally, and walking away wasn't in his nature. He returned to demanding roles that required strength, endurance, and long hours. Westerns, action-heavy films, television appearances, the pace barely changed. On the surface, it looked heroic. Underneath, it was relentless. His body had been through something catastrophic, but the expectations never eased. Those close to him noticed the difference. He moved more carefully, spoke even less. The toughness remained, but it was quieter now. Less about showing strength, more about enduring whatever came next. And perhaps the most unsettling part was this: he rarely talked about the accident at all. No dramatic stories, no warnings, just silence, as if acknowledging it would give it power. But the physical scars were only part of the story. The quieter struggles were still unfolding. The quiet struggles no one saw. After the accident, something shifted, not in a way most people could immediately see, but in ways that slowly reshaped Clint Walker's life. He survived, returned to work, and outwardly looked the same. But the rhythm of his career and the weight he carried internally were no longer unchanged. The industry had moved on. Westerns weren't the cultural force they once were, and the towering cowboy image that made him famous now worked against him. Leading roles became less frequent. Offers still came, but they were smaller, quieter, often made for television. To the public, it looked like a natural slowing down. To Walker, it felt like being gently pushed aside by the same system that once relied on him. What made this period harder was his nature. Walker wasn't a man who complained or explained himself. He didn't give interviews about pain or fear. He didn't reshape his image to stay relevant. He accepted the change without protest, even as it narrowed his world. Those close to him later suggested that the physical toll from years of demanding work, especially after the accident, never truly faded. There were limitations he didn't advertise, discomfort he worked around, and a growing awareness that his body, once treated as indestructible, had limits he couldn't ignore anymore. Emotionally, he remained guarded. Relationships lasted years, even decades, but Walker kept a part of himself sealed off. Strength, to him, meant control, and control meant not burdening others with what he felt. That mindset had carried him through hard labor, war-era service, Hollywood pressure, and now a life forever changed by how close it came to ending. His daughter would later hint that much of his endurance went unseen, not dramatic suffering, not chaos, but quiet persistence. Showing up, doing the work, refusing to let vulnerability define him. To fans, Clint Walker remained the same steady presence, calm, solid, unshaken. But behind that image was a man adjusting to a life that no longer moved at the speed it once did, and learning, slowly and privately, how to live with what he'd survived. And for years, that truth stayed hidden, until time, distance, and loss finally allowed it to surface. What his family spoke about later. For years, the image never cracked. Clint Walker remained the towering cowboy, the survivor, the man who simply kept going. But after his passing, those closest to him finally began to share a quieter truth. Years later, family reflections suggested that much of what he endured was never spoken about openly. The accident wasn't just a dramatic moment he survived, it changed how he lived afterward. There was lingering pain, caution, where there hadn't been before, and an emotional weight that came from knowing how close everything had come to ending. They didn't describe scandal or chaos. What they revealed was something far more human, a man who chose silence over sympathy, who believed strength meant not burdening others, and who carried the consequences of a brutally physical life without asking for recognition. Fans had admired him for decades without realizing how much endurance it actually took to remain that composed. The legend had never been fake, it was just incomplete, and that understanding makes his final chapter even more powerful. The myth versus the man. Clint Walker will always be remembered as a Western icon, the embodiment of strength, height, and quiet authority. But beneath that image was a man shaped by hard labor, controlled by Hollywood expectations, and tested by moments that should have ended everything. He survived what most people wouldn't. He returned when others would have stopped, and he carried on without explanation or complaint. His passing wasn't sudden in the dramatic sense, it was the closing of a life that had been demanding from the very beginning. Maybe the real strength wasn't the roles he played or the image he projected. Maybe it was the way he endured, quietly, privately, and without ever asking the world to see the cost. And once you know that, it's impossible to watch him the same way again.